19th century men who forever changed the United States. Welcome to this Unclassic road trip adventure matinee to meet 9 men that are intricately woven into the fabric of the United States of America. This cast of characters are exceedingly different and colorful in their own special ways. 3 were presidents, 4 were men of the trails, and 4 shared their talents through an ink pen. Whether you're relaxing at home in your armchair, gridlocked in traffic on the highway, or driving a tractor trailer to pick up your next load, I'm sharing with you men who played a pivotal role in American history. I hope that you will share this adventure matinee with a friend. Let's start out west in the Rocky Mountains and move across the nation, ending at the eastern seaboard. Half man, half myth. He couldn't read or write a single word of English, but he could read the stars, the rivers, and the tracks of a grizzly better than any man alive. Before the GPS, before the railroads, and before the settlers, there was the king of the mountain men, and his name was Jim Bridger. Old Gabe, as he was often called, survived things that would make most people turn back in a heartbeat. From surviving 2 iron arrowheads in his back to being the first to see the Great Salt Lake, Bridger's life was more incredible than the tall tales he loved to tell. He didn't just survive the West, he mapped it in his mind and guided the rest of us through it. When I heard a particular tall tale told by Jim Bridger, I can never sit at a campfire without letting out a private grin. My thoughts rolled to him telling a tale with such passion and strength of how Indians captured him, when one of the children, holding on to his every word, interrupted him with this question: "What happened next?" Bridger solemnly replied, "They killed me." Jim Bridger wasn't just a man, he was a map in human form. As a geography fanatic and lover of maps, he has always intrigued me. Bridger spent nearly 50 years exploring the American West when it was still a blank space on the charts of the U.S. government. Born in Virginia in 1804 and raised in St. Louis, Bridger entered the wilderness somewhere around 18 years old, answering an ad for enterprising young men to join the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. The 1820s and 30s were the golden age of the mountain man. Bridger lived smack in the middle of it, with a life of constant peril, surviving brutal winters, grizzly attacks, and skirmishes, and 3 Indian brides. Bridger was the first white man to see the Great Salt Lake, one of the most famous discoveries on the continent, right at 200 years ago. He famously and mistakenly thought he had reached an arm of the Pacific Ocean because it was salty. Reasonable, don't you think? In 1847, he met with Brigham Young at Big Sandy Crossing, southwest of South Pass. Bridger advised the leader on the best route to the Great Salt Lake. An historical marker is found on the highway at this famous spot where this monumental meeting in American history took place. Bridger was tough as iron with a little help of 2 Blackfoot warrior arrows. What? He had been shot in the back during a battle back in 1832. This tough mountain man lived with one of those 3-inch iron points embedded in his back for 3 years. Finally, missionary Dr. Marcus Whitman cut it out without anesthesia. Who needs anesthesia when you're a mountain man? Marcus Whitman is a tale for another day. Thanks, Doc. Old Gabe was known for his tall tales. He'd tell travelers about petrified forests where petrified birds sang petrified songs. While people thought he was lying, he was actually describing the geothermal wonders of what would later become Yellowstone. Have I ever mentioned that Yellowstone is my second favorite national park? There are petrified trees indeed. One of the, if not the, most difficult hikes I've ever accomplished was to Specimen Ridge in Yellowstone National Park to see petrified trees. I wonder if Bridger went up there. I just realized that he probably did. Bridger explored and trapped in Yellowstone approximately 20 years after John Coulter. Coulter resided there after leaving the Corps of Discovery. You may have heard of Coulter's Hell. That's an early name given to the geyser basins at Yellowstone. Bridger was one of the first white men to see Yellowstone's geysers. He led many Western expeditions between 1820 and 1850. It is said that Bridger knew more about the Rocky Mountains than any other person did. As the beaver felt hat went out of style and the fur trade collapsed, Bridger refused to head back east. He adapted by establishing an immigrant supply stop with Louis Vasquez called Fort Bridger. Records show the fort opened in 1843, and almost overnight it became the most vital pit stop on the Oregon Trail. Ownership of the fort transferred to the Mormon Church in the early 1850s. The post became a military outpost in 1858 and a state landmark in 1933. Travelers today can take the exit off I-80 to visit the recreated fort with perfect detail and excellent period timepieces to take you back to when Jim and Louis walked these grounds. I will show you something special at the park cemetery soon. One of the biggest mountain man rendezvous reenactments in the West occurs there the first weekend of September. Check the website for this Wyoming State Historic Site for hours and any updates prior to your visit. We have been been there twice and on our latest visit parked at an RV park just across the fence from the historic site, situated in the tiny town of Fort Bridger. I'd appreciate if you took a second to like, comment, and to subscribe. Back to Bridger. Pioneers on the overland trails heading to California or Oregon stopped at Jim's Fort for supplies and directions. Old Gabe's reputation as the ultimate consultant for westward expansion reached across the country over and over again. If it happened in the opening of the American West, it affected or was affected by Fort Bridger. He was the man in the know. Bridger eventually started working as a scout for the U.S. Army, guiding expeditions through the very mountains he had trapped in decades prior. Experience always pays off. Wearing his wide-brimmed hat, Bridger discovered an alternate overland route named Bridger Pass in 1850. This new path lessened the trip for Oregon Trail immigrants a significant 61 miles. Bridger Pass became the route chosen by the Union Pacific Railroad, proving it was a stellar choice. Bridger also blazed the popular Bridger Trail in 1864 that led to the Montana goldfields. I'll talk about other landmarks named after Bridger in a minute. As life moved on and decades passed, Bridger's health and eyesight began to fail. A cruel irony for a man who lived by his vision. He chose to retire to a farm in Westport, Missouri, which is now a suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. Bridger's life was deeply shaped by the women around him. He was married 3 times to Native American women, a Flathead, a Ute, and a Shoshone. It was often that these women managed the domestic side of Fort Bridger, acting as vital cultural bridges between the pioneers and the local tribes. He was widowed twice. His daughter, Virginia Bridger, was the one who cared for him in his final years in Missouri. Virginia was born at Fort Bridger. I bet you know why he named his daughter Virginia. Virginian James Jim Felix Bridger drew his last breath July 17, 1881, at the age of 77. Originally buried on his farm, his remains were later moved in 1904 to Mount Washington Cemetery in Independence, Missouri, marked by a row of tall hedges, the fine-looking monument, and a list of his achievements, ensuring the king of the mountain men would never be forgotten. As a fan of this legendary figure, seeing his final resting place was epic. And now we've come to the time that I need to tell you that special thing that I wanted to show you. It's at the Carter Cemetery, at the back, at the Fort Bridger State Historic Site. You will find graves of many people, but the one that is most intriguing is the one of Virginia Bridger Hahn, the daughter of Jim Bridger. And as I mentioned, she was born at Fort Bridger, July 4th, 1849, and she died March 7th, 1933. Thanks, Virginia, for taking care of your dad. Many historians consider Bridger the greatest and most respected mountain man in American history. His map may have been in his head, but we've put it on the land. Today, you can't drive through the Rockies without seeing Bridger's name plastered on maps and road signs and historical places, like Bridger Teton National Forest, the Bridger Mountains, Fort Bridger State Historic Site, Bridger Bowl Ski Area, the Bridger Trail, Bridger, Montana. Next time you're in the mountains, look for the highest peak. Old Gabe probably crossed over it. Boots on the ground, taking you on an unclassic road trip to meet more historic figures of the West and showing off significant places. Sitting Bull. His story is one of fierce independence, unwavering dedication to his people, and a tragic clash of cultures. Today, I'm delving into the life of one of the most iconic and influential Native American leaders. As a young boy, his courage and skill were evident after he counted coup on a Crow warrior. His dad conferred his own name, Sitting Bull, onto his 14-year-old son. The name roughly translates to Buffalo Bull, who sits down. That is why we refer to him as Sitting Bull. Sitting Bull's father was known as Jumping Bull from that point forward. I will be revealing not only Custer's Last Stand and Wild Bill Cody's Wild West show, but filling in some hidden gaps in the life of Tatanka Iyotake. Like the adopted Annie Oakley, grab a coffee and let's journey back to the vast buffalo-filled plains of the 19th century. The year is somewhere around 1830, and we're near many caches along the Grand River. By the way, this is just west of Mobridge, South Dakota. Her holy door delivers a son who would become the most famous leader of the Hunkapapa Lakota Sioux tribe. I want to jump back to the coup stick. Used by Plains Indian warriors, the act of counting coup was accomplished by touching an enemy without causing harm. This significant achievement symbolized bravery, leading to prestige and honor. Sitting Bull's rise to leadership wasn't just about his prowess in battle. It was also about his wisdom, spiritual insight, and commitment to his people's traditions. While President Ulysses S. Grant and the cavalry were placing non-complying warriors on wanted posters and demanding they relocate to reservations, Tribal leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull vehemently opposed these policies, refusing to surrender their traditional way of life, their hunting grounds, and their freedom. The Plains tribes must face the encroaching white settlement in solidarity. Sitting Bull's reputation crossed not only tribal lines, but found its way into the ears of the cavalry. Prominent figures like Lieutenant Colonel Custer placed him in their sights. It wasn't a personal vendetta, but rather a consequence of the United States' westward expansion and its policy of confining Native American tribes to reservations. In 1874, a U.S. Army expedition led by George Armstrong Custer confirmed that gold had been discovered in the Black Hills of the Dakota Territory, an area sacred to many tribes. The Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 determined that this region was placed off limits to white settlement, a treaty that was not kept by the white man. Despite this ban, gobs of prospectors rushed to the Black Hills. In response, Sitting Bull refused to adopt any dependence on the U.S. government. He was left with no choice. He and other leaders were forced to be nomads. Tension culminated. One of the most famous conflicts in American history erupted, the Battle of Little Bighorn. It was June 25th and 26th, 1876. Custer rode straight into a well-devised trap. Just visualize this epic confrontation. A combined force of 2,000 tribal warriors, led by prominent figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, squaring off with 600 soldiers on the rolling, grassy hills. You won't want to miss a quick glimpse into a few great Wild West sites that cross paths with Sitting Bull's life, including Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument, Fort Beaufort State Historic Site, and a couple of Buffalo Bill sites. It was a stunning victory for the Native Americans, a test to their skill and determination, but it was a Pyrrhic one. Also remaining relentless, the U.S. cavalry pursued the bands and tribes who had disbanded after the Custer fight. Refusing to submit, Sitting Bull led his band north to Wood Mountain in May of 1877. Being in the Northwest Territories of Canada, which is now Saskatchewan, they were beyond reach of the U.S. Army. Life at Fort Walsh was harsh, and with dwindling buffalo herds and increasing starvation, Sitting Bull was finally forced to sojourn south. On July 29, 1881, Sitting Bull met with Major David Brotherton at Fort Beaufort in Dakota Territory to surrender.
I surrender this rifle to you through my young son, who I now desire to teach in this manner, now that he has become a friend of the American people. I wish to teach him the habits of the whites and to have him educated as their sons are educated. I wish it to be remembered that I was the last man in my tribe to surrender my rifle.
Sitting Bull, as recorded by Joe Culbertson, Indian Scout. It was a somber moment, marking the end of an era of free-roaming Plains tribes. Beginning in late 1881, Sitting Bull and his family were prisoners of war for 20 months at Fort Randall, Dakota Territory. Finally, they were allowed to settle at Standing Rock. I'm not even going down the Annie Oakley rabbit hole, but Sitting Bull met her while performing in a traveling cowboy and Indian Wild West show that went across Canada and the northern U.S. Sitting Bull ceremonial adopted her because he was so impressed with a little sharpshooter. In a surprising turn of events, Sitting Bull briefly joined Buffalo Bill's Wild West show back in 1885. He traveled with the show for only about 4 months. Buffalo Bill Cody is one of the most famous characters of all the Wild West. A little more about him later. Sitting Bull definitely observed the curious ways of the white world while sharing his culture, performing in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. It was highly stylized and often misunderstood. He was a sensation, but he never truly embraced the showman's life, always remaining true to his people. The freedom and autonomy that Sitting Bull cherished remained elusive. The ghost dance movement regained momentum, a spiritual revival among Native Americans prophesied the return of the buffalo and the disappearance of the white man. U.S. authorities became increasingly paranoid about this situation. They feared Sitting Bull's influence on the movement would incite an uprising, and this placed him back in their sights. On December 15, 1890, agents of the Indian Affairs Police were sent to arrest Sitting Bull at his cabin on the Grand River. Indian Service Agent James McLaughlin at Fort Yates ordered his arrest. A close-quarter fight erupted, and within minutes, 14 men were dead and 2 others were fatally wounded. After the police were fired upon by Sitting Bull supporters, Sitting Bull was shot in the chest and head by Standing Rock policeman Lieutenant Bullhead and Red Tomahawk. The Lakota killed 6 policemen immediately, and 2 more died shortly after the fight, including Bullhead. 2 horses were also reportedly killed. Sitting Bull was only in his late 50s. He had 5 wives and 5 children. It was a tragic and senseless end to a life dedicated to his people's freedom. There is still a major debate about where Sitting Bull is actually buried. Some say North Dakota, others say South Dakota. A new marker at Sitting Bull's original grave can be found in Fort Yates, North Dakota. We camped in Fort Yates, which overlooks the Wahey Reservoir. Lots of signage near the Standing Rock Administrative Building provides a deeper perspective into the Lakota, Dakota, Arikara, and Nakota people. Legend has it that in 1953, townsfolk from Mobridge, South Dakota, only 50 miles away, stole his bones from the, at that time, ramshackle gravesite. Some reports claim his body was reinterred at the request of 4 grandchildren. Mobridge townsfolk constructed a 20-ton concrete monument to their hero, Chief Sitting Bull, along the western shore of Lake Oahe, technically the Missouri River. Some records state it this way. In 1953, his remains were reinterred at a memorial site near Mobridge, South Dakota, a place closer to his birthplace and spiritual homeland. A fitting tribute to a man who fought tirelessly for his people and their ancestral lands. Sitting Bull is often remembered only for the Battle of Little Bighorn, but his time in the Wild West show and his spiritual leadership in the ghost dance movement show a much more complex man. Sitting Bull's life was one of controversy and legend. Sitting Bull's legacy endures as a symbol of resistance, courage, and the enduring spirit of the Native American people and the profound impact of westward expansion. His story is a powerful testament to the importance of understanding and remembering all perspectives in the tapestry of history. Many historic sites are found along the 35-mile Standing Rock National Native American Scenic Byway that will perfectly supplement your personal trip to dig deeper. And I want to tell you a little bit about a few other sites you will find of interest. Little Bighorn Battlefield National Monument is located south of Billings. Look into and across the valley to the location of the Battle of Little Bighorn. In less than an hour, Custer and his immediate command were wiped out. It was the greatest defeat the U.S. Army ever suffered during the Plains Wars. Custer took his last stand, which is sometimes used as a cliche. The engaging Indian Memorial presents the background of many who fought and died while defending the Arikara way of life. The park's Battlefield Road leads to 17 stops on the 4.5-mile auto tour road between the Reno-Bettine Battlefield and the Custer Battlefield. The construction of a new visitor center may impact your visit, so I always recommend that you check the park website for any closures or advisories that might affect your visit. Plan around 3 hours to take in most of what the park offers, including a stroll through the Custer National Cemetery that was open for military burials until recent times. When crossing between central Montana and northeastern Wyoming, take the exit for this national monument. You'll be glad you did. Built in 1866, Fort Beaufort protected the confluence of the Missouri and Yellowstone rivers and surrounding territory from Indian raids. Sitting Bull had led several of these raids. Named for the Union commander of the Battle of Gettysburg, Major John Beaufort, the fort housed 6 companies of soldiers at its peak. The fort also served as a detention area for tribal leaders and those who fought being relocated to reservations. 2 famous leaders detained there were Chief Joseph and Sitting Bull. Fort Beaufort State Historic Site is in close proximity to the Fort Union Trading Post National Historic Site, a partially reconstructed post near Williston. Like many sites in the northern United States, the buildings are only open seasonally. Plan ahead. There's also a Missouri-Yellowstone Confluence Interpretive Center presented by the North Dakota State Historical Society that you'll drive right past. Go ahead and stop in to peek inside and walk the path to the geographic significant confluence of these 2 famous rivers. This is a historian triple header. We have been to several Buffalo Bill, also known as William Cody sites, such as his Scouts Rest Ranch in North Platte, Nebraska, the birthplace of the legend statue in Oakley, Kansas, and his gravesite on Lookout Mountain in Golden, Colorado. The Buffalo Bill Museum and Grave are among the most popular cultural and historic attractions in the Denver area. Another stop for Buffalo Bill fans is the Sheridan Inn in Sheridan, Wyoming. William F. Buffalo Bill Cody was once part owner of the inn, and many of his acquaintances were guests. Every room is decorated in honor of these historic individuals, such as Sitting Bull, Will Rogers, and Ernest Hemingway. The front desk clerk showed us the Teddy Roosevelt suite. I'll have to go back to see the Sitting Bull room. Order the prime rib. Other places of interest are Agate Fossil Beds National Monument in northwestern Nebraska and the South Dakota Historical Society Museum in Pierre. Thank you for joining me on this compelling journey through the life of Sitting Bull. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, comment, and subscribe for more historical deep dives. Let me know in the comments what other historical figures you'd like me to cover. Ugly shoes on the ground, crossing state lines, Unclassic road trip. I hope you investigate my history playlist. They say history is written by the victors, but usually it's remembered in shades of gray. But here in St. Louis, the story of America's greatest general is actually bright green. In 1860, he was a 38-year-old failure, a man who dropped out of the Army, failed at farming, and was reduced to selling firewood on street corners just to feed his kids. But just 4 years later, this same man was the commander of every single Union soldier in America, trusted by Abraham Lincoln to do the one thing that no other general could: win. Ulysses S. Grant isn't just a name in a history book. He is the greatest comeback story in American history. How did a man who hated the sight of blood become the butcher of the Confederacy? How did Ulysses S. Grant go from a drunkard to the face of the $50 bill? Today we're looking past the $50 bill to find the man who saved the Union. The story is found at the Paris Green, Whitehaven, a critical stop for any fan of Union General and U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant. The family estate of Whitehaven holds the secret to where Grant spiraled from a war hero back to a humble farmer. Even more paradoxical, this man who fought against slavery lived here at Whitehaven, a slave plantation. Most people think of Ulysses S. Grant in black and white. They see the stoic general who ended the Civil War, or the 18th president on the $50 bill. But here, on the south side of St. Louis, Grant lived in Technicolor. Specifically, this very bright shade of green. Welcome to Whitehaven. Today we're stepping inside the home where the man who saved the Union was just a guy trying to make ends meet. To understand the general, you have to understand the husband. And to do that, you have to come here, to the house that saw Grant at his lowest point. We're at the Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site. It's impeccably maintained. But the first thing you notice, obviously, is the paint. Why Paris green? Ulysses and Julia picked that outstanding color for their home in 1874. This wasn't just a fashion choice. It was a status symbol. It showed the world that the Dents and the Grants were keeping up with the latest trends. As the guide explained, this Paris green wasn't just a bold choice. It was a statement that signaled the Dent family, Grant's in-laws, were people of means. But for Grant, living at Whitehaven was a lesson in humility. He moved here to be with the love of his life, Julia Dent. The tour guide provided great tidbits about the Dents and the Grants and really emphasizing the couple's bond.
You see behind me was built in 1816. In 1820, it was purchased by a man named Colonel Dent. And Colonel Dent didn't have any sort of military connection. He just really liked the way Colonel sounded in front of his name.
Behind the scenes, Grant was so soft-hearted that he couldn't stand to eat meat that wasn't charred because he hated the sight of blood. Hard to believe. He was a West Point Grant. This wasn't the home of a conqueror. It was the home of a man who knew what it felt like to fail. Grant was famously destitute during part of his time at Whitehaven and often seen by his father-in-law, Frederick Fayette Dent, as a failure. Julia was a woman of high social standing who stayed alongside her husband through this hard-scrabble years. She saw the greatness in him when the rest of the world just saw a struggling veteran. Julia was his rock, and Whitehaven was a sanctuary. The secret weapon in Grant's life was always Julia Dent. While the world saw a quiet, rumpled man, Julia always saw a hero. Their romance is the heartbeat of the spark. She was his sunshine, and his desire to provide for her is what kept him going through his darkest years, a time of deep depression before the Civil War. The outbuildings in the museum on site do a beautiful job of showing the reality of the era, including the difficult history of the enslaved people who worked this land for the Dent family, a reality that Grant lived with before he eventually fought to end the institution of slavery. Inside the on-site museum, the history gets personal, showing off artifacts of a man who was, by many accounts, a failure at this point in his life. But the museum also focuses on his brilliance. It is packed with artifacts that make the history feel tangible. It's quiet, it's beautiful, and it reminds us that even our greatest heroes had to start somewhere. The park does a masterclass job of showing that dramatic change. Grant won the White House by a landslide, but he quickly realized that politics was a battlefield where you couldn't see the enemy coming. He took his military loyalty to the Oval Office, and it became his greatest weakness. Grant was a warrior in a den of thieves. While Grant was focusing on rebuilding the nation during the Reconstruction era, the men he trusted were busy robbing it. So how does a man go from farming this land in St. Louis to having a massive statue on horseback at the foot of the Capitol in D.C.? Grant was the unconditional surrender general. He was the one who finally understood how to win the Civil War, and he did it with a mix of grit and humility. He learned right here on this St. Louis farm. By the way, that statue in D.C. is the largest equestrian monument monument in the United States. Grant wasn't just a soldier. He was a president who fought for civil rights during Reconstruction, using the same quiet grit he developed right here in this Paris greenhouse with Julia. Grant's final battle wasn't against an army. It was against time. Bankrupt and dying of terminal throat cancer, he spent his final days in agonizing pain, racing to finish his memoirs. He finished the last page just days before he passed. It became a bestseller, earning his family the equivalent of millions today. Even in death, Ulysses S. Grant refused to surrender. He was a failure, a hero, and a protector. If you think we should remember the man behind the money, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of the people who built history. Thanks for joining me at Whitehaven. The Ulysses S. Grant National Historic Site is more than a history stop. It's a reminder that success isn't a straight line. If you're in St. Louis, take one afternoon and come see the Paris Greenhouse. It might just change how you understand this part of American history. In the footsteps of the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark Discovery Expedition, along the Missouri River banks at St. Charles, May 21st, 1804. This was their campsite. They returned to this campsite a little over 2 years later. Will Clark, Meriwether Lewis. Lewis is the one with the big hat. Find the statue at Frontier Park in St. Charles, Missouri. The Lewis and Clark Monument. St. Charles has welcomed travelers for well over 200 years. Captain William Clark and the men of the Corps of Discovery experienced this hospitality with a ball held in their honor on the evening of May 16, 1804, as they awaited the arrival of Captain Lewis and his dog Seaman. This monument commemorates these famous explorers as they faced the unknown West in anticipation of great discoveries. And who were some of the pals that went on the trip with them? Well, this is John Coulter. John got really smart and he stayed in Wyoming. That's why Yellowstone was once called Coulter's Hell. And there's Francois Labiche. Francois was one of the experienced boatmen recruited shortly before the Lewis and Clark expedition departed. He had enlisted in the Army on May 16, 1804 at St. Charles. James McKay, not part of the expedition, but he shared maps with Will Clark that proved valuable information about the Indian tribes and their customs. Please be sure to subscribe. One of the plaques has selected excerpts from Captain Clark's journal while at St. Charles. And who's this one-eyed fiddle player? It's Pierre Creuset. He was recruited and joined the Lewis and Clark expedition there at St. Charles encampment. He was a talented fiddle player, providing entertainment for the men as well as the natives. Not far away, find the Lewis and Clark Boathouse and Museum. May 21st, 1804. Set out from St. Charles at 3 o'clock after getting every matter arranged. William Clark, which means the possible bag was filled. And what's a possible bag? The explorers carried a bag known as a possible bag because it contained everything it could possibly hold. Let's just see what was in this possible bag. Hide containers, an awl, a short starter, a knife, a compass, flint and starter, a tobacco twist, a clay pipe, trade beavers, salt, a comb, and a toothbrush. Well, that was smart. Flip-flops on the ground. Unclassic road trip. Travel across America with me. Join me on a journey through history as we explore Beauvoir, the home of Jefferson Davis in Biloxi, Mississippi. Walk with me through the Jefferson Davis Presidential Museum, filled with Civil War artifacts and memorabilia. Learn about the estate. Visit the cemetery where veterans and their families rest and discover the story behind the death mask of President Jefferson Davis. Immerse yourself in the mid-19th century Southern history with time period dress tour guides and gain a new perspective on the Civil War. Experience the breathtaking view of the Gulf Coast from this historic site that has witnessed over a century and a half of change. Let's delve into the past and understand the complexities of American history at Jefferson Davis's home and Museum in Biloxi, Mississippi. The Jefferson Davis Home and Museum is a fascinating world of information and history related to the mid-19th century. You won't believe some of the things that we found in the home and in the museum and at the cemetery. Jefferson Davis is one of the most historically significant individuals in American history, and a lot of people do not know much about this man, who was at one time the President of the Confederate States of America. This home offers a unique perspective into the past, and I want to point out that this home was never a plantation home. It was built and always maintained as a private residence and was never part of a plantation. And the Davis family was not the original occupants nor owners. The time period dress tour guides help to immerse you in Southern culture and history. It's no secret that Jefferson Davis is a controversial character in American history, but we must look at some of these things with a balanced view. This is a historical homestead and worth visiting. We need to learn why things like the Civil War would make a brother turn against his own brother. These are things that we must research deeply, and this video certainly cannot do any justice to that part of this incredible topic or this dark part of American history. I just want to point out some features of this beautiful home, some interesting artifacts and things that are held at the Presidential Museum, and take you to this Confederate soldier burial ground. And did you know that Jefferson Davis was imprisoned? And do you know that he has 2 burial sites? As I mentioned, this museum is filled with lots of memorabilia, documents, and Civil War artifacts. Many uniforms and artillery are displayed there, and many personal possessions of Jefferson Davis. And look, this is Jefferson Davis's death mask. The making of death masks was common in this time frame and popular into the 1930s. One of the reasons that this practice ceased was because of the advent of photography. The museum, the cemetery, and the home are all within short walking distance. There is a charge for admission for the tours, and they are open 7 days a week, 9 to 5. The Jefferson Davis Home and Presidential Library is located at 2244 Beach Boulevard in Biloxi, Mississippi. Have you subscribed? If not, why not? And if you haven't, can you please subscribe? Leave a comment below. One of the most interesting things that we saw at the cemetery, besides the tomb of the unknown soldier of the Confederate States, were these binders filled with information about those that were interred there. It was very touching and interesting. Not only soldiers are buried there, but their wives, plus Samuel Davis, Jefferson Davis's father, is also buried there. One of the interesting things about the house is it wasn't really that large. We learned that the high ceilings helped with the heat by allowing the heat to rise, and the large doors and windows would allow the breeze from the magnificent coast to cool down the home. There was a ladies' parlor and a gentleman's parlor, and the library of Jefferson Davis. I have done previous videos talking about Traveler and other famous war horses, but we found on the grounds in front of the home a marker for Traveler. This was President Jefferson Davis's dog and faithful companion. I want to encourage you to visit museums like this and explore more historical locations that hold such significant and similar importance.
70 years old, still standing in spite of all those little Mother Nature temper tantrums that we call hurricanes, including the big K, and that's not thousand, it's Katrina.
I also want to invite you to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for more videos on historical information about this amazing nation. And of course, I include tons of videos on great places to tour and visit of geographic significance. 75% of the furniture in this home belonged to the Davis family. Beginning in 1903, Beauvoir was a Confederate veterans' home. The home has been restored to how it was when President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, lived there. It is also a Biloxi landmark with a date of circa 1852. Hurricane Katrina played havoc on this property, leaving it closed for many years before it could be restored and opened to the public view. Some of the damage and restoration from Katrina. There are several other structures on the property that are also open to be toured. As far as the museum, one could spend a day or two just taking in all of the information from the amazing exhibits. And there is a rotating exhibit gallery. One of the highlights of the museum to me was this West Point Cadet uniform. It is very similar to the one that Jefferson Davis would have worn while he was in attendance at West Point. This was used in the funeral procession of Jefferson Davis on December 11, 1889, in New Orleans, reflecting both the late president's involvement in military affairs and his wife's desire for a military procession. It features examples of armament in its design, placed upon a Louisiana State Militia caisson pulled by 6 black horses. Carrying the remains of Davis in a copper-lined casket was provided with an 8-man honor guard. An estimated 50,000 citizens viewed it as it led the 3-hour-long procession from Lafayette Square to Metairie Cemetery. And we have been to Jefferson Davis's original burial site in Metairie. President of the Confederate States of America, Jefferson Davis died of acute bronchitis from malaria on December 6, 1889. He was buried in the tomb of the Army of Northern Virginia at the 150-acre Metairie Cemetery at the South's greatest funeral. Many cities and states petitioned for his remains, and in May of 1893, at his widow's request, his remains were reinterred at Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, but only after the Louisville and Nashville Railroad car traveled to specific locales, including Beauvoir, his home in Mississippi. On May 31, 1893, over 75,000 people witnessed the procession into Hollywood Cemetery, where at 3 p.m. he was honored by a 21-gun salute before being reinterred. On October 17, 1978, a joint resolution passed by Congress and signed by President Jimmy Carter restored Jefferson Davis's citizenship, effective December 25, 1868. That is Confederate Memorial Day, and it is celebrated in Louisiana on June 3rd, Davis's birthday. When the surrender of General Robert E. Lee and General Joseph Johnston and the Confederacy in dire need of supplies and men, the certainty of defeat hung in the air at the Capitol in Richmond, Virginia. President Davis and Verena, his wife, had taken different paths to retreat from the Capitol, and though their paths converged, they parted once more until they met again near Irwinville, Georgia. On May 10th, 1865, federal troops found the travelers in a camp and captured President Davis. The war, which had begun in cheers and celebration, ended in defeat and despair. In 4 years, more than 700,000 soldiers died in a war that redefined the country. President Davis was arrested. His early days were painful and humiliating as he was kept in leg irons and held in a damp casement. Public outcry in the North led to him being placed in a more comfortable cell, and he was allowed letters and gifts from his family. Eventually, Verena and their youngest child, Winnie, were allowed to stay at Fort Monroe in an apartment that would normally be assigned to an officer. On June 11, 1866, the U.S. House of Representatives voted that there should be a trial of the former Confederate president. Ultimately, there was no trial because it was felt that such an affair would impede the course of reunification for America. In May of 1867, Jefferson Davis was released from prison on $100,000 bail after 2 years. He had been stripped of his livelihood, his health, and finally, his citizenship. He traveled to England, Europe, and Canada, and the U.S. At the urging of family and acquaintances, Jefferson decided that he wanted to write his memoirs, originally wanting to call it Our Cause. He wanted people to understand the reasons that the South had for secession, to have equal representation in Congress, to have the right to govern their people under the Articles of the Constitution, and to abolish excessive and unfair taxation of their crops. There's so much to learn, and I encourage you to go and visit this site in Biloxi, Mississippi. Tennis shoes on the ground. Unclassic road trip. Andrew Johnson, from the poorhouse to the White House. Following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln. It was a tough job, but Andrew Johnson had the tough job of following in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln. Let's take a look at this commoner who became president. How did it all begin? Travel across America with me. Andrew Johnson, 17th president, was born December 29, 1808. We are in downtown Raleigh, North Carolina, and this is our 17th president, Andrew Johnson. He was a tailor by trade, and he served in the following political offices: mayor, state representative, state senator, U.S. representative, governor, and vice president. And yes, president. Vice President Andrew Johnson was the first president in U.S. history to resume the role following the assassination of the president. He was the third vice president to become president because of the death of the president. Andrew Johnson had to bring the country back together after the bitter and long Civil War that divided the nation. President Andrew Johnson would bond the Union. I'm going to be giving you a bonus feature at the end of this video. We'll be going to the Mordecai Historic Park and seeing all the great buildings and displays. But back to Johnson. Did you know that Johnson was the first president to be impeached? But let's go back in time to the beginning, to this very unassuming home, which was technically a kitchen with a loft apartment. As the sign reads, Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, President of the United States, 1865 to 1869. Born near here in a kitchen. Now located 1 mile northeast. And yes, it's located at the Mordecai Historic Park. I will take you to that park, but you'll have to hang on. If you really want to learn more about Andrew Johnson, I want to recommend that you go to Greenville, Tennessee, to the Andrew Johnson National Historic Site. It is a wonderful place to learn about the excellent Taylor, who became the 17th U.S. president after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln on April 15, 1865. The courageous commoner became vice president in 1864. Johnson never attended school because he was so poor and owed most of his education to his wife Eliza. Go Eliza! Thank you. He was the first president to never study law, nor to have been a military hero, a true commoner. Johnson moved to Greenville in 1826. In adjacent blocks, toured the replica birthplace and one of his early homes. A few blocks from the visitor center, we stopped at his well-maintained homestead that is open for free tours. I took the opportunity to rest in one of the rockers on the porch. The traditional story of Andrew Johnson's birth is held firmly in place by the preservation of a small historic structure located in the Mordecai Park in Raleigh, North Carolina. I know, I've been telling you that. That small building, probably built in the late 1700s, was part of a complex of buildings known as Casso's Inn, a well-known hotel of that period located in Raleigh. This inn was where Andrew Johnson's father worked as a stable-keeper and his mother worked as a weaver. According to tradition, Andrew Johnson was born in the loft of the kitchen at the inn. The story goes that on December 29, 1808, a wedding party was in progress at the tavern when the festivities were interrupted by news of the birth of a baby to the Johnsons. Oh, that's cute! According to the same tradition, the bride went to the cabin at the back of the inn to visit with the baby and his mother. Oh, that was sweet of her. The building you see here is a replica of that birthplace of Andrew Johnson. It represents an important part of the Andrew Johnson story and speaks of a man who began his life in a very humble condition and later became the 17th President of the United States of America. Please subscribe. Andrew Johnson is known as the Reconstruction President. Investigate more to determine if he truly was. The Andrew Johnson homestead was the last home of Andrew Johnson. As congressman, he purchased the house and half-acre lot from James Brannan in 1851. This is a fashionable Greek Revival home, but it does reflect the older federal style of architecture. It was restored in 1956 and 1957. Did I ask you already? Could you please subscribe? Thank you. And remember the bonus feature at the end of this video. I'm taking you to the Mordecai Historic Park buildings in Raleigh. Andrew Johnson bought the land that comprises the Andrew Johnson National Cemetery in 1852. According to family tradition, Johnson enjoyed coming to this spot for peace and meditation. It afforded superb and unpopulated views of the mountains in the distance. Because of its height and unobstructed view of the railroad, it was used during the Civil War for signaling, and it became known as Signal Hill. It was Andrew Johnson's request that he be buried here, and he was on the 3rd of August, 1875. At the crest of the hill, the Masons carried out the rites of burial. The family erected the tall obelisk over Andrew and Eliza Johnson's grave in 1878. There was a dedication ceremony, and afterwards, this became known as Monument Hill. This cemetery is located only a few miles from the main part of the historic site. He was the first person buried at the cemetery, and it is still open to qualified veterans and their spouses. He had died of a stroke on July 31st. Although he was a slave owner, he and his wife's view on the subject changed over time. We hear that repeated in history over and over again. One day in 1863, Eliza announced to their slaves that they were free and could leave. They all chose to stay. One of their devoted lifelong slaves, William, remained at Johnson's side for 10 days straight until Johnson drew his last breath. Johnson died while visiting his daughter Mary in Carter County. Johnson had purchased William's mother at the young age of 12, and he bought her brother Sam too. Johnson freed all the slaves in the state in 1864, and at his request, his body was wrapped in the Union flag with his personal tattered copy of the United States Constitution placed beneath his head. Let's talk a little bit more about Andrew Johnson. A statue of Andrew Johnson, the self-made man who was born in North Carolina, is located on the grounds at the state capital of Tennessee. He followed in the political, philosophical footsteps of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson. He served as a Tennessee state legislator, governor of Tennessee, U.S. representative, U.S. Senator, and Vice President under Abraham Lincoln. He held nearly every elected office on the local, state, and federal levels during his lifetime. But he never ran for president. Many remember Johnson as the first president to have been impeached. Johnson had removed an elected official from office, a move that many in the Congress deemed unconstitutional. Johnson held to the power granted to the executive office with a strict interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. This caused opposing congressional representatives to call for his impeachment. Only 35 senators voted him guilty, which was one vote shy to convict him at the Senate trial. He was not removed from office. He purchased the vast, mineral-rich Alaska Territory from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million. Secretary of State William Seward orchestrated the purchase of the coin Seward's Folly, as public opinion held that it was not a smart acquisition. And we know now it was a tremendously smart acquisition. As president, he granted amnesty to former Confederate President Jefferson Davis. I would say flip-flops on the ground right now, but I can't because it's time for the bonus feature of Mordecai Historic Park and all the cool buildings that we walked around. You won't believe the history that is found at this gorgeous little park on the north side of downtown Raleigh. It's part of the park's recreation and cultural resources of the state of North Carolina. You will want to park at 1 Mimosa Street and go over to the Park Visitor Center to begin your tour. It's filled with great exhibits. And did I mention that the tours are available starting at 10 a.m.? But back to the Visitor Center. You enter on the side of the mansion. Welcome to Mordecai Historic Park. It is located on the last 3 acres of the former Mordecai Plantation, historically one of the largest in Wake County. By 1860, the plantation had grown to 1,200 acres and produced corn, wheat, cotton, and other crops. Sitting as the center point of the plantation, the Mordecai house was occupied by the family for 5 generations, from 1785 until 1964. That's a long time, 5 generations. Also living on the Mordecai grounds in 1860 were approximately 120 enslaved African Americans who were responsible for most of the tasks on the plantation. Today, several Raleigh neighborhoods, including historic Oakwood and Hayes Burton, stand on former Mordecai land. Please subscribe, and if you have, thank you. And if you haven't, could you take just like 1 second and just push that button and subscribe? Thank you. The pronunciation of Mordecai is different depending on who you talk to, I guess is the best way to put it. I've heard it called Mordecai, and I was told by one of the curators at the museum that the family called it Mordecai because they were wanting to get away from the traditional pronunciation. You won't want to miss all the great exhibits and artifacts and information in the history of this Jewish family in Raleigh, North Carolina, and their faith. Patty Mordecai, a great-granddaughter of Jacob's, lived at Mordecai House from her birth in 1860 until her death in 1949. Though a lifelong Episcopalian, she showed interest in her Jewish heritage. Learn about the 5 generations who lived in this home. Now, let's step across the street to the historic park section where they have all these great buildings. Remember, if you want to go in, you've got to pay. The first building, this green one, is the Federal Building. Built circa 1847, the Federal Building is sometimes referred to as an early post office because local tradition held that it was used for that purpose. Architectural and paint analysis indicate it was a government structure of some type. St. Mark's Chapel Built circa 1847 by enslaved carpenters, this chapel once stood on John Houghton's plantation near Gulf, North Carolina. An Episcopal chapel, it was only for the use of the Houghtons, their visitors, and the enslaved people on the plantation. These enslaved people sat in a segregated gallery above the main section of the chapel. St. Mark's was deconsecrated and moved to Mordecai Historic Park in 1978. Please comment and please give me a like. Continuing down the path. The Allen Kitchen was built in 1842 in Anson County in the yard of the Allen family home. This kitchen was moved to Mordecai Historic Park in 1968 and placed on the location where the original Mordecai kitchen once stood. Before the Civil War, enslaved cooks worked in the Mordecai's kitchen to prepare food for the family. Exterior kitchens were common in the South due to the great amount of heat generated from the fire. And then there's Ellen Mordecai Garden. This is a recreated kitchen garden based on first-hand descriptions by Ellen Mordecai in her book, Gleanings from Long Ago. The garden contains heirloom varieties of vegetables, herbs, fruits, and flowers appropriate for an 1830s garden. And we found these beautiful flowers and these vegetables that were free for the taking. Do you think we took any? This was the plantation office, built circa 1826. This building served as an office for the family as they ran the plantation. It may have also been used for the family's law practices. The Mordecai House, built in 1785. The Mordecai House is the oldest home in Raleigh on its original foundation and was the seat of the Mordecai plantation. The original portion of the home was built in 1785 for Henry and Polly Lane by Henry's father, Joel Lane. The home acquired its name from Moses Mordecai, who married the oldest Lane daughter. After Moses' death, state architect William Nichols designed the 1826 Greek Revival addition. It is a Raleigh historic site. The Mordecai House, circa 1785 and 1826. This house faces the parking lot on Mimosa. You might want to check out the Raleigh Historic Trolley Tours. Flip-flops on the ground. Unclassic road trip. Be sure to watch my other videos on Raleigh and Durham. And don't forget to subscribe. From the poorhouse to the White House. Most of us know his name from the spine of a book we haven't opened since high school. I've walked the floorboards of his humble farmhouse. It's his birthplace in West Hartford. And I've walked the halls of his New Haven home, where he penned his historic writings. But Noah Webster wasn't just a guy who liked to spell. Are you curious how this all transpired? When he turned 20, his father handed him an $8 bill, which was basically worthless back then, and told him he was on his own. No pressure, right? Thanks, Dad. Noah Webster was $8 away from failure. I'll fill you in on the $8 bill in a bit. I'm standing here in his birthplace in West Hartford, Connecticut. Let's walk through the 2 floors and see what we can find. Looking at these small rooms, you realize he wasn't born into the elite, hence the $8 bill gifted to him by his dad. Isn't it clever how they have the words with pronunciations on the doorways? Very Websterian. This farm boy with a massive chip on his shoulder grew up to be a man with a revolutionary idea that America couldn't truly be free until it stopped talking like Britain. Leaving home at 16 years old, he entered Yale College. Webster's time at Yale coincided with the American Revolutionary War, and he, like many students, experienced a sense of pride for his country. Upon graduation in 1778, Webster's plan to continue his studies was interrupted by a lack of money. Instead, he took the one job available to him, teaching, and I think this was the time frame that his dad gave him the $8 bill. After the war came to a close, Webster frowned upon the use of British textbooks in American schools. America's youth should be learning the history and customs of the United States, not its former empire. In 1783, he took it upon himself to remedy the situation and published in 3 parts the Grammatical Institute of the English Language. You won't find Noah Webster in the painting of the Founding Fathers who drafted the U.S. Constitution. You want to know why? Because he was not an official delegate. They said he was stubborn and judgmental and quick to criticize and slow to forgive. Webster made enemies early on, apparently, and they blocked his chance of representing Connecticut at the convention in Philadelphia. But he went anyway. In between careers, Webster worked tirelessly to perfect the dictionary that would become synonymous with his name. Noah was a bit of a wanderer, but his most productive years were spent in New Haven, in a home he built in 1825 for his family. If you've been to Greenfield Village in Michigan, you've seen the house where the magic happened. But here's the kicker. Henry Ford literally had that house dismantled and moved from Connecticut to Dearborn in 1936. Ford was obsessed with Webster. Webster had drawn his last breath in 1843 in this home. Ford caught the house just as it was slated for demolition by Yale. Some declare Henry Ford literally stole this house. It's a bit ironic. The man who standardized American English had his home preserved by the man who standardized the American car. It had taken Webster 28 years to finish his American dictionary. To do it, this man learned 26 languages, including ancient literary Sanskrit and Hebrew, just to track down where our words came from. Impressive, don't you think? Now, if you look at some of his portraits, there's this mysterious one with a skull and an illustration of slaves. It feels dark, doesn't it? What's the mystery of this skull painting? I was wondering and trying to research and find out what's the deal with this skull painting. Was Noah, the fierce abolitionist, making a statement? Well, actually, the Birthplace Museum made this montage, and I was able to catch this not-so-great photo of it. Most of the time, the lighting in museums is not placed with visitors taking photographs as a priority. Kind of frustrating for people like me. Apparently, the skull represents the science of the time, and Webster often used it to argue for the common humanity of all people, regardless of race. Webster vehemently believed a unified language was the first step toward a unified, free people. This is the original, and that's the partial solution to the mystery painting with the skull. Back to the world's most famous dictionary, Webster's 1828 dictionary. I know this is the most nagging question. So why isn't it just called the Webster? Well, Noah was a bit prickly. He wasn't great with money, and he died in 1843 with lots of unsold books. Two brothers, George and Charles Merriam, they stepped in and bought the rights. These marketing geniuses hitched their name to his legacy, and that's why today we check Merriam-Webster for our Wordle answers. I prefer to include this quote from Noah Webster upon completion of the Magnus Opus. When I had come to the last word, I was seized with a trembling which made it somewhat difficult to hold my pen steady for writing. The cause seems to have been the thought that I might not then live to finish the work, or the thought that I was so near the end of my labors. None of us can even imagine what a sense of accomplishment Mr. Webster felt. How did you feel when you completed that composition for English 301 using a typewriter with only liquid paper to help? No computer with spell check, and certainly not AI to compose it for you. Maybe now you think of him more than just a dusty name on a book. When you go to the Grove Street Cemetery in New Haven, look for the Egyptian Revival Gateway. This is one of the most beautiful cemeteries in America. Noah and Rebecca's graves are under an obelisk. It's very him, tall, sharp, and standing its ground. His gravesite is not actually at Yale, as often reported, though he's surrounded by its history. When you stand at his grave, realize Noah Webster is the reason that every time you write or say color or music, instead of the way that it is said in Britain, you're speaking his language. He didn't just write a book. He gave a new nation its voice. I am not neglecting to tell you that before the United States settled on the standard denominations we use now, like the 1, the 5, and the 10, the currency system was a bit of a wild west. Both the individual colonies and the Continental Congress issued paper money in a wide variety of odd amounts. During the Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued Continentals to fund the fight against the British. They printed $8 bills in multiple emissions between 1775 and 1779. Have you ever heard the saying, as worthless as a Continental? By the way, don't miss lunch at the 1850 Eagle Tavern at Greenfield Village. Order something unique from the time period menu. We did. Travel note, Greenfield Village is open seasonally. Check the websites for dates and hours. Don't miss getting inside because of seasonal closures. Tell me in the comments the last time you pulled out a dictionary to look up a word. I did, just last week. Today, the modern dictionary most people rely on is on their phones. Do you really prefer the digital age, or do you long for the day to actually go to a library and pick up a book? Noah and I would appreciate if you would subscribe. Please share this video with a historian or a bookworm in your life. I hope that you have enjoyed this fresh approach video on the father of American lexicography, also known as the schoolmaster of our republic. Tennis shoes on the ground on an Unclassic road trip, learning more behind-the-scenes info on historic figures shaping our republic's history through the centuries. It's all about Herman Melville's fictional pulpit. You'll find it at the Seaman's Bethel, a non-denominational church in New Bedford. It's part of the New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. It was a beautiful day the day that we visited. We started our tour downstairs. It's called the Old Salt Box, so named of yore by whalers blunt on trips ashore. The Old Salt Box, preserving place for men redeemed of every race. The task of getting the whalemen into the schoolroom was not easy. You see, a lot of them were illiterate. They needed to take classes on reading, writing, arithmetic, and navigational skills. the men would have to admit that they were not literate, not an easy task for adults even today. In addition, there were many other choices whalemen could make regarding the time they spent on shore. But one way to get these guys downstairs into this classroom, this schoolroom, was to call it a salt box. And this is a term that the whalemen were familiar with, since the salt box was an area located just beneath the decks of the ship in which the salted meat was stored. So this gave them an out. There were plenty of displays with all types of photographs and documents about the whaling industry. But a lot of this is about Herman Melville. You'll have to wait a minute before I get to Herman Melville. This small organ was placed in a wheelbarrow and wheeled down to the waterfront, a tradition that is continued today every Memorial Day. That would be cool to see, wouldn't it? As we were walking upstairs to see the main chapel, we read this sign, "In memory of Captain George Fred Tilton, 1861 to 1932, whaleman, who in 1897 walked 3,000 miles through Alaskan winter to save the lives of 200 men on 4 whale ships caught in Arctic ice." Wow, that guy is a hero, isn't he? Once upstairs, there is plenty to see, like this clock that was manufactured in nearby Roxbury, Massachusetts. It's sort of a small chapel, and if you've never been to a church in New England, you have no idea how uncomfortable these pews are. Have you subscribed yet? If you are a subscriber, I thank you for subscribing. If you're not, please do that now. The tables mounted on the side walls, they look a bit like gravestones, don't they? They are called cenotaphs. The word comes from the Greek, and it means empty grave. When a whaleman was lost or buried at sea, family and friends ashore had no grave to visit. If they desired, they could pay to have a cenotaph placed in the whaleman's chapel, and they could come to pay their respects to their loved ones, just as folks would visit a cemetery. And I want to read a couple of them to you. Erected by captain, officers, and crew of the bark J.D. Thompson in memory of Isaac Sanders of Newburgh, New York, who died on board January 21st, 1857. In memory of Benjamin Franklin, son of Otis Norton and Susan Grinnell Pierce, lost in Balanes Bay, lower coast of California, February 23rd, 1863. In memory of the men on the Scalloper Navigator, lost at sea November 30th, 1977. Current time, guys. But here's what you've been waiting to see. The pulpit. Herman Melville's pulpit. It's a curious thing, and here's the backstory. It was in Moby-Dick. Herman Melville wrote 3 chapters about this seaman's Bethel, and in that there was one element that helped make the Whaleman's Chapel famous. Yet, get this, it is a result of Melville's imagination. When Melville writes of the Whaleman's Chapel, he describes the pulpit as being suggestive of the front of a ship. But the pulpit, when he visited, was not prow-shaped. In all probability, it was a typical New England box-style pulpit. The pulpit in the Whaleman's Chapel today, here's another twist, is not due to Melville's book, but to the movie, which was released in 1956. The director of the movie, John Huston, was an Irishman, and he went to Ireland to film the movie. The pulpit scene in the movie is unmistakably the prow of a ship. When the movie was released, it was hugely successful, and one result was that Americans wanted to visit New Bedford to see the Seaman's Bethel with that pulpit in the Whaleman's Chapel. The only problem was they arrived expecting to see something that did not exist, and they were not happy to discover an ordinary pulpit in the chapel. The new pulpit was first seen by visitors in 1961, and since the pulpit met expectations, the grumbling stopped. The pulpit remains today, and visitors always refer to the movie and novel Moby-Dick when they see it in person. A couple other things about Melville particularly. There are 43 pews total in the Seaman's Bethel, one being famously marked with the plaque, Herman Melville's Pew. From what we know, Melville liked to sit in the same pew every visit he made to the Bethel. Visitors from all over the world come in and sit and take a picture in the famous pew. This display included some wood that was from the foundation of this structure. It was loaded with termites, and fortunately, it was caught in time, and they were able to save this tremendous bit of American history. This plaque erected in recognition of Herman Melville, 1819 to 1891. Well, it's kind of neat as numbers reverse each other, 1991. Seaman extraordinary, whose voyages lured him across the stormiest of all seas, within the heart of man, where he discerned the primordial beauty and terror of this world and the danger-ridden labors of the whaleman, and told the story of it with undismissed glory in that immortal saga of the sea, Moby-Dick. And I like this quote of his the best. "It is not down on any map. True places never are." Herman Melville, Moby-Dick, 1851. Flip-flops on the ground. Unclassic Road Trip. Be sure to subscribe and comment below. Thank you so much for watching this Adventure Matinee. I hope that you'll check out the other Adventure Matinees that have been posted. More to come.